Hello. Today I'm here with Theodore Sutherland, one of the handful of folks doing search funds in the education space, a topic that I have found personally very interesting. I've had a couple of different connections to search funds over the years. I have not had experience with one myself. So it's sort of fun to quote unquote interrogate folks who are in the process and getting a live action view of how the education space is changing from a different perspective than the venture capital side. So, I write a lot about the venture capital side, a little bit about the private equity side. Search funds are in this fun in between space. So I'm really excited, Theo, to dig in with you. But before we do that, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, and how you ended up where you are today?
That's good. And it's so good to meet you. Actually, just have this conversation with you in this context as well. I feel like we've had really good conversation about education, so I'm excited to talk about it from the search fund world. Background for me, I grew up in Ghana. Most of my life, I went through the British model of education, which I did not enjoy at all. In high school, you had to kind of choose to either do the STEM track or the humanities track. You actually kind of do both. And that felt very limiting for me. I didn't feel like I was able to make a informed decision about what I wanted to be over the next, career of my life in high school. So I decided to only apply to liberal arts colleges. That brought me to the States. I actually went to the same college my African American grandfather went to, small liberal arts school called Bates in Maine. It was during the global financial crisis when I started 2007. So rich time to be learning about how the world was changing and grateful I wasn't in the job markets because I was seeing all the
Yeah.
seniors sweating, thinking about what's the New York streets, etc. We're going to be bringing in as entry level talent. So it was a rich time. Really enjoyed college. The year I graduated, though, most expensive colleges were being talked about as being in America. Most expensive college in America that year was the college I went to. It was $67,000 that year. And I checked recently, it's now closer to like $80,000 and no longer the most expensive college in America. It's wild to just think about that price tag because for me, at least at that time, that was like a pretty decent, like nice house back home. And I just really was grappling with the question of how do you make innovative education more accessible? And I'd say that question has driven a lot of my career decisions, even now, this choice to go into search funds as well. I spent probably about a decade right after that in the education world, mostly as an joined two GSB grads to launch a series of companies, which are now called the African Leadership Group. So I used to head up our UK accredited university, STEM university, redesigning education to make it more practical. So very experiential, which we really enjoyed. That revenge on the UK system that I had there. Did a lot of workforce development training for companies like GE, usually on frontier skills, like digital twins or cybersecurity development skills. Did a bunch of EdTech investing personally, but also advising investors like Owl and some of the investors in Africa, like Future Africa. So fun season seeing it from the operating lens and then from the investing lens as well. I think a lot of the questions I started to grapple with was I've seen a lot of really good companies that were being built in education, or I should say good products, but I felt like the capital to finance those companies was a mismatch. The venture world didn't seem to be the right fit of capital for a lot of companies that could otherwise have really good impact on students' lives, on teachers' lives, and the education systems overall. So when I decided to come to grad school back in the States, a lot of the questions I was grappling with was what's the right type of capital to grow small businesses that don't need to be venture scale to be, effective and successful. And I landed on search funds. It's a class at HBS called the Financial Management of Small Firms. It's more broadly known as the entrepreneurship through acquisition path. So I think that was a really good fit for me in a couple of lenses. One, there was a really big focus on identifying companies that are dominant in a niche and really building those companies out, which are usually under-leveraged assets. In the case of education, I'd say it's a great fit because a lot of companies that were built that were effective were built by educators, and the companies had usually grown to the point where they themselves had to felt like this is bigger than me now. I need somebody to take it to the next phase. It's more than the scope of what I signed up for. So really good fit from that lens of niche company, really good product market fit, now needed the business operations to scale. And I'd say secondly, the search fund world, a lot of the money up until recently, I'd say it was very much in the high net worth individuals, family offices, a few institutional investors, some of whom, for example, have long-term funds as well. So that just gave a lot more flexibility as well in terms of if you wanted to run the company over the long term, you didn't need to go the PE model of selling after 5 years in order to make the returns work for the founders of the team as well. So that was also very attractive. So when I graduated last year, I decided to launch a search fund, raise capital, institutional capital in my case, a few family offices as well. but very much with that lens of wanting to get back into the education space and really identify spaces that were severely underdeveloped, had huge growth potential, which is why like the industrial training space you and I have spoken about was really attractive. I think the search model could add a lot of value for buying assets that were historically being trained in very in-person heavy ways. And now I think there's a appetite really to move the needle, both on the pedagogy front, but also just on training for productivity and then just compliance or licensure. So that's been a lot of what's set me down this path.
Exciting. Yeah, and I feel like we should probably get Fred on at some point and do
At
an
some point.
African leadership group sort of debrief.
That's true.
It's still going, sort of. It's sort of 10 years in the making, and I think is still relatively underappreciated in the
Mm.
context of the edtech space. We'll bookmark that for future
Another
discussion.
day. Sounds good.
So I think on the search fund front, like, I read about this from the sidelines. My wife just finished business school and search funds were a hot topic at Wharton, just as they were at HBS. I guess like the question is why, right? And like what about it makes it different, more interesting, more compelling within certain industries, right? And so the trope, just to get out ahead of it, is like you go and you get like an HBS grad who buys like an HVAC company, right? Or like an exterminator, right? Is another big one.
Best control.
And, I don't want to like lead the witness too much, but like, why might a search fund be a little bit more interested in an education business versus HVAC or Terminators or other thing? Like, are there certain characteristics? And I should say, like, education is a consistent top topic in the search fund
Mm.
space as well. Like, why is that? What are the characteristics of the businesses that you're looking at that make it interesting for a searcher?
Mm. So I answer that from a couple of angles and you can drill down as interesting. I think the first is that you're right. Search funds historically have been known as the asset class that buys unsexy businesses. And so the HVAC, the pest control, the roll-ups of accounting startups, like totally, that's been their world. I think the last, I say 7 to 10 years, you've actually had a shift from purely, I'm going to call them mostly service businesses, to now starting to buy more software businesses as well. And just really increase the aperture of the types of enterprises that software investors, search fund investors have been willing to put money behind. And I think what that's done is it's brought in a sense of possibility that people can suddenly see. I'm not interested in HVAC, would never buy that type of business, don't want to move to North Dakota, but I would totally be interested in buying a company that perhaps is doing something more missional, like education, which of course is very directly a big part of why this shift is happening and the interest in the space. And so I think just the increasing of the types of opportunities search funds are willing to invest in has itself just opened up more imagination for what's possible. And I think that just means more spaces become viable, including healthcare practices. It's growing beyond education in that sense. I think the second part definitely has been attracting missional people as well. Historically, I'd say a lot of the attention for why people have been interested in search funds, economics, the model has generally returned better than any of the other asset classes because you're buying underleveraged assets. It doesn't take too much to move the needle, more to be imaginative of what levers you need to do. But secondly, I think there's also been really a good shift in terms of how do you make these education specific assets where, like I was mentioning earlier, really started by somebody who is deeply passionate about teaching and learning. Like they built this business. It's now, yeah, 5, 7 million revenue dollar business. They're at the point of potentially retiring, but also usually at the point where the business is growing beyond what they're capable or want to take on. They've dominated. For example, I'm talking to a company that has really done well in one state for training like assisted living, like staff, etc. The idea of now doing this again in another state is not an exciting prospect for somebody who's in their 50s.
To the
So
owner,
to the owner, exactly.
the current owner.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
the current owner. So the owner is like, yeah, we could do that, but that's more sleepless nights. I'm trying to spend time with my kids. We're trying to go to college games. Idea of spending more energy, and I'm taking like an easy $500,000 in like earnings home. I'm not trying to do that extra work. And so I think that tipping point really, which is again, I'm talking about this in the context of education, but more broadly is true in search, just opening up the doors for folks seeing that, hey, I could build a business that is good financially, but also has really good missional alignment as well. So I think that's probably part of what's shifting the needle in those spaces as well.
Yeah. I mean, to layer in my own thoughts on this, like education businesses also have a much lower cost of goods sold typically.
Sure.
With HVAC businesses, there's a lot of inventory. No matter, even the most efficient businesses are going to have a lot of physical cost involved in a way that education businesses tend not to. Some that are training specific types of hardware and whatnot, to our discussions about the industrial space, will have more. But even that, you're seeing VR companies come into the space and do at least the sort of top of funnel training to
Mm,
make sure folks do want to get involved in those types of fields.
yeah,
So that's what's sort of been interesting to me is it's both maybe a little bit more commoditized in that, like, the same way that I don't have to buy goods to enter the space, neither do you.
exactly.
But it also makes the business a little bit more interesting and closer to software than,
Exactly.
again, pest control, those types of things. So,
Exactly. I mean, I think that's spot on. I think for the same reason EdTech has really taken off in the last couple of years, the same reason and opportunity folks are seeing, how do you apply that to old businesses in niches that folks are not targeting? An example comes to mind of a business one of my investors actually helped buy that used to do a lot of like DEI training. They used to sell this DEI training on DVDs and they were cash flow positive. I asked everybody I asked in terms of like, when do you think this business was bought? They're like, 2000. 2010, maybe. Like this business was born in 2019. And they're like, what? That's too recent for selling DVDs as your like bread and butter and your multi-million dollar like EBITDA business. It's crazy, dude. So the lady who took that business over, the path was pretty straightforward. She was just like, I'm translating this business into the digital world. That's my growth strategy. And she absolutely killed it, sold the business last year. And so that's what I mean by like some of these spaces where there's just really low hanging fruits of bringing the industries into the modern world. And the playbook has been largely set for how you build edtech businesses. There's a lot of references for how you can price them, etc. So the playbook just needs to be applied in a sensible way.
yeah, and you brought up states before too, which I think is a really interesting thing of like there's all sorts of funny regulatory quirks that say like training an allied health professional in Tennessee is different from training them in, Arkansas,
New
right?
York or whatever.
New York, right? So that's sort of an interesting, like, well, that may be true, but like Theo, could train them in all the states, with the right set of capital to back me.
Mm.
How do you find this type of business? So I imagine they're not just like posting on LinkedIn, hey, you want to buy my business? Like, what do you do?
It's funny. Actually, I have had the odd moment of an HBS grad back in the day ping me and say, hey, I came across your profile. I'm actually thinking about selling my business. I'm looking for the right owner. I was like, I'm pretty
Sweet.
sure this is the first time this has happened. But I say that because I think part of what's also happening broadly in the ecosystem of search related to your question is, at least from my perspective, a lot of folks are coming into the industry and choosing to focus on spaces where they have prior experience. And that gives them both just an understanding of the market, some network to leverage, and an ability to differentiate like their story at a time when AI just makes it so much easier to find business owner information and reach out to them in mass. And so I think that differentiation actually plays a really big advantage in finding these companies. Tactically, what that's looked like for me, I'd say primarily there's been a lot of code outreach. And so kind of identify a niche. I looked, for example, at like nuclear training as one of those areas as a way to kind of power the future. In those spaces, you're kind of trying to identify with the lead providers, who do you think is either already on the cusp of disrupting the industry and leading by a large margin, and kind of identifying those companies, hitting them up usually with the way I've done it, I've mostly approached it with like a white paper of sorts. Here's my insights from the industry, talking to experts, as a way to build credibility. And so that's been cold outreach as one path. Second path has been a lot of just niche conferences. Guys, the conferences that exist and the gatherings, the first ever gathering of like electrical safety for data centers happened last year. Like that's very specific. And the room was packed, 150 people who are, that's their job. So they're here to try and solve that problem.
Who
And if you're the
organizes
only,
that? Who's like, I need to throw
who's
a
the
conference
association
for
lead,
this? Okay.
it's usually people in the industry who are just like, we recognize that there's no forum for us, and we're trying to solve problems that require usually coordination around standardization,
That makes
coordination
sense.
around like we have just gaps in industries that it actually the demand is just so much it doesn't make sense for any one of us to try and solve this problem. How do we
Yeah.
actually surface more of this data centers that you can imagine are exploding? Folks like that just
Yeah.
like we having work is not the problem. Finding the right supply of talent, etc., is actually more critical for us to solve. So you're seeing odd kind of collaborations just from huge demand in those types of spaces. So those niche conferences I think have actually been super helpful because you're getting a lot of context, building a lot of just human relationships, and usually able to meet business owners in those contexts as well. I'd say lastly has been oddly enough referrals and just like networks of people who are in the spaces. And so for example, in the ed space, as you know, there's a bunch of like specialist investment boutique firms, Titan, etc., have been super helpful in the journey, both for getting a sense of like just benchmarks as you're trying to think about pricing deals, but also potentially can help you find specific deals for what you're looking into as well. So I'm grateful, and I've seen actually the surge of individuals as like brokers who are coming into the space from an M&A background in ed, as well as boutique investment banks which specialize in the space. So it's been those are I'd say the primary paths in like identifying organizations and through that reaching out to them try and make a direct connection.
Yeah, the banker connection makes a lot of sense in that, like, I would imagine that the transaction value of a search fund is probably just below their typical threshold for like them taking a deal to market. But then ideally, if you're successful, you would then bring the deal to them for
As the
the
exits.
the next transaction for the exit.
Yeah,
So
that's
that feels
that's
pretty logical.
that's largely true. I'd say the self-funded deals tend to be sub, say, $7 million like ticket value. Search fund traditional deals, which the type of capital are raised. I know people who've bought businesses up to like $130 million like total enterprise value. So we are very much actually within the range of what boutique investment banks would want
Gotcha.
to be able to offer. I think where the differentiation comes in is we're not trying to pay the highest price. And
Right.
so that's where having either a differentiated angle in how you think about valuation and or growth path for the business, where the business owner is just like, I like this guy's idea for where the business, my team, my legacy will go more than the other guys. And I'm willing to take, some dollars off the table to make that happen. And so I have been successful in some of those more brokered processes, even if I haven't been the highest bidder, mostly because they're like, the questions you ask in diligence, etc., are just so much more nuanced that it shows you understand my industry in a way that even a financial buyer or strategic buyer hasn't been as thoughtful. So I think that's where winning comes in, search funds in the broken process.
Yeah, and I think you sort of mentioned it before, but I want to double down on like the traditional sort of trope about search funds is it is a recently minted MBA entering
Mm,
a industry where they have no experience.
that's true.
And I can understand how that makes them a target. And I think search fund performance has been pretty good, so I think I don't know how true that trope is. Usually there's a grain of truth. But you specifically, I would hope are sort of more of a profile that the industry turns towards of not only do you have a solid graduate degree in, a the financial field, but also you have industry experience and you're hunting in an industry you know relatively well and have connections in. I don't know quite enough about search funds to say that's the future of the space, but to me, it follows relatively logically that as the search fund industry gets more sophisticated, that's the
Mm.
type of persona they would look for in a searcher.
Yeah, I think there's definitely angles. You're already starting to see these kinds of like more vertically focused search funds, but also search investors. And we only do vets in regulated spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's more likely to happen and kind of how the PE landscape also evolved to become more vertically focused than generalists. So I think that's happening here as well.
And maybe just to round out our conversation, you talked a little bit in the intro about how this fills a sort of capital niche that is underserved by traditional private equity and traditional venture.
Mm,
Can you just like walk through that and like how the different expectations or how expectations change in those different parts of the capital stack?
sure. I mean, I'd say keeping it simply at VC growth equity P and the VC market, as you can imagine, there's usually investments with the idea that two or three of the companies in your portfolio will actually end up being the winning guys, in which case they have to grow exponentially really quickly in order to actually meet that growth need. And sometimes doing that, at least historically, in an unprofitable way as well. So you're really funneling growth is the idea behind the VC model. I think a lot of the education companies in finding product market fit it usually take a longer time to get buy-in, actually get that cycle of sales, but also proof of concept in. And the markets usually also aren't actually that big in practice when you are trying to get commercial like returns, even if you're trying to sell into government and grants, etc. I think there's still limitations on that front. So EdTech hasn't, at least on the B2B side, proven out as a really great case for a VC. There are a couple of exceptions, and there are enterprise cases that are viable, but I'm going to use that just as a proxy there. The second case of growth equity, and maybe it's easier to start with a private equity model. Private equity model is more buying safer businesses, proven assets that have grown significantly, and now you're more optimizing for both an efficiency of how they deliver value. So that's why they have a kind of reputation for cutting costs and figuring out where in the business can you actually take out resources and still be able to deliver. And then secondly, they usually are taking on kind of add-on but marginal improvements in the business, not really making fundamental investments
Or
necessarily,
strategic acquisitions.
or strategic acquisitions and add-ons to that business as well to grow the company such that when they sell it, it's a larger organization in its totality. So in that extreme, yes, there is a case still. There's a lot of PE activity actually in the education markets as well, but a lot of founders, especially in the brackets that I'm dealing with, the founders are still so close to their teams that even that they're selling the companies, they still want the teams and their legacies in many ways to go on, if you wish, not just untouched, but like built upon and grown to the next stage because it's still a reflection of them. They don't want to be going to a grocery store on Monday, and they're hearing stories from the person they used to work with that this guy,
Layoffs.
yeah, laid off,
Yeah.
totally messed it up. The culture is bad. They still live with these people. So I think that's why that extreme in many cases hasn't been as attractive. Then the middle ground of like a growth equity play. Growth equity is typically investing in a specific growth strategy. I'd say kind of in between on expectations in terms of, you're not doing a 10% growth a year, but you're not also doing like a growing 100% a year as either of those extremes. So it is reasonable. I'd say actually for a good number of companies, it could make sense, but it is a new amount of pressure expectations for the founder because the growth equity investor is not becoming the owner. They are becoming a minority investor typically to help you get to the next phase. And if the founder, like I was describing, doesn't really have the energy, I don't want to go into a new state. I don't want to launch a new product. I don't want to find product market fit for yet another thing. It's just not a personality fit for where the business is at that stage. So search funds kind of fit into that ecosystem of capital options by providing a new owner, providing capital, which is good for both liquidity, but also growth capital, and providing usually new networks as well, because it's not just the founder, it's not just the new searcher who's coming in, but also the network of people that they bring that will help take the business through to the next stage of growth, and really building it in a responsible way as well, because you're trying to preserve and grow equity as opposed to like cut costs as a prime way of building the business future. So that's how it fits into the ecosystem. I will say there has been, because search has been so successful in just consistent returns, there is so much money available for lower mid cap companies. Like there's family office money now. There are a bunch of family offices like starting to set up direct investment vehicles, especially if they come from those spaces as well. I know I'm a media company, that's their bread and butter. They've chosen to invest almost exclusively in education companies now and hold them over the long term. It's a very valuable value proposition for a founder, especially if they want to stay in, have a successor they can identify, still want some liquidity. So I think what's great is that as more capital comes into a space where returns have been consistent, there will consistently need to be refinement of what the value proposition is that the search funds bring to the ecosystem. For now, I think it's actually pretty strong.
Awesome. Yeah, that's exciting. And to your point, there are, a bunch of companies that we used to look at that were like, 5 to 20 million in revenue, decent EBITDA, decent margins, but like weren't growing like crazy. And it was hard to
Mm,
figure out what to do with them, right?
yeah.
And I do think search is a pretty reasonable response to that of, provide some liquidity, keep some incentives around to start growing a little bit faster, but
Mm,
don't fire the whole team. Don't like do anything that crazy.
dramatically.
Yeah. So maybe last question, what are we buying? What's on the table? When do we put a deal through? What are you looking for? Like what's the story?
So I've mostly focused my search fund on identifying workforce development businesses, kind of park the education K-12 higher ed stuff in part because of all the questions around the Trump administration dealing with that
Sure.
and the ESSA grants, etc.
Yeah.
Workforce dev, I think, has been fascinating. There's so much opportunity, man. Had a field day mostly in the industrial training space, which I've spent a lot of time in, which I think I hope I buy a business in. There are a couple of companies I'm under discussion with right now,
Exciting.
um, which is really exciting. You're catching me also in a good week. I just went to a safety conference. I think there's about 4 companies already that we're like directly engaging with about sale. Same premise. Owner who's in like 55 range, really great business, strong cash flow, but wants to spend more time with the kids and thinks the business can still do more growth, wants to make sure the team is set up for success as well. So that's been really exciting. Yeah, TBD, when I actually buy a business, you will definitely be one of the first to know. But I think they will definitely probably all be in this landscape of wanting to really upgrade training in a space that has been underappreciated. Think something like nuclear training now has a lot of demand, especially because there's just a silver tsunami of experienced talent having to retire. So you have to leverage things like EdTech as a way to scale training to meet the demand. So that's where I'm excited to kind of bring my background and product and sales, etc., to do that type of work and transformation to help the company, help the industry, and hopefully take those types of companies global as well. There's so much demand around the world for just rethinking the models of education and building some examples that folks could learn from. So I'm excited to do that as well.
Yeah, I think there's a whole other angle to this of like how do you match, you know, new industry tailwinds, like
Hmm.
the nuclear renaissance, if you will, with, of course, that would demand more training and upskilling of an industry that had its last sort of golden age in like the 70s and 80s. And like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it
it makes
did.
sense that there'd be, some real demand for both training and new ownership across the
Exactly.
spectrum of that industry. So,
Exactly.
I'm a little bit jealous that you get to look into those types of things, and I'm excited. I can't wait for you to call me and be like, "Hey, man,
It's
it's
done.
time
It's done.
to announce a deal."
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well,
Uh,
it's been good. I think
awesome,
the good thing just about the industry is you meet good people like yourself throughout the journey. Lots of owners are happy to advise me and give perspective, even if they're not selling. So it's been a really good run. I've enjoyed it and I'm grateful.
awesome. Well, thank you for coming on. Looking forward to getting this out there, and yeah, I will keep my eyes peeled. Sounds like safety first. Maybe some other industrial training also on the
Yeah.
table.
Watch this
Fingers
space.
fingers crossed.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Have a good one. Thanks so much for making time.
Thanks.